It was supposed to be just another high society wedding, flawless, well-rehearsed, and void of drama. The venue was a lavish country estate tucked into the hills, the kind of place people only saw in magazines or Pinterest dream boards. White roses curved over antique stone archways, and classical music floated gently across the perfectly trimmed hedges. But behind all the glitter and champagne glasses, one woman stood trembling behind the stage curtain. Her name was Alara. Alara never expected to be invited to her ex-boyfriend's wedding, let alone asked to perform at it. When she received the ornate invitation 2 months earlier, her hands shook so badly that she almost dropped the envelope. She thought it was a joke. Her friends urged her not to go. "He doesn't deserve a minute more of your heart," they told her, but something inside her needed closure, or maybe something inside her just wanted to see with her own eyes that the love she once held so tightly had truly been handed over to someone else. She never replied to the RSVP, but 3 weeks before the event, she received a call. It wasn't from the groom Mason, but from his fiancée, Leila, a woman Alara had never met, but had seen in blurry photos online. Leila's voice was surprisingly soft, gentle even, as she explained that Mason had mentioned Alara's voice, how beautiful it was, how he used to talk about the song she'd written late at night when no one was listening. "We'd be honored if you'd sing at the wedding," Leila said. At first, Alara thought it was a cruel setup. But as Leila spoke, her sincerity became undeniable. She wasn't being manipulative. She sounded genuinely grateful, even nervous to ask, and something in Alara cracked open. She agreed. The day of the wedding came far too quickly. Alara spent that morning in silence, pacing her apartment, clutching the lyrics of a song she'd written years ago but never performed, because it was too personal, too raw. It was a song Mason had once heard her humming, but never fully finished. That morning, she finished it. The moment Alara arrived at the venue, she felt like an outsider. Heads turned. Some guests recognized her. Whispers fluttered behind sequined dresses and expensive cologne. She walked past people who once smiled at her when she was Mason's girlfriend, now unsure if they should make eye contact. But she didn't care. She wasn't there for them. As she waited backstage, she could hear the ceremony starting. The soft voice of the officiant, the shuffling of nervous laughter, the flutter of camera shutters. Every sound was a needle. She had let go of Mason, or at least told herself she had, but being there, seeing it all unfold, made her doubt everything. And then, it was time. A soft knock on the dressing room door. A young coordinator peeked in and whispered, "You're up after the first dance." Alara nodded, clutching the microphone like it was her last anchor to the earth. The moments leading up to it blurred. The speeches, the applause, the laughter, it all faded into a low hum in her ears. But the second she stepped out into the light, everything sharpened. The crowd fell into silence. Most of them didn't expect her to show. Few expected her to actually sing, and not a soul expected her to sing like that. She didn't introduce the song. She didn't say a word. The lights dimmed slightly, and the soft instrumental began. A single piano chord, then another. The room held its breath. Her voice broke the stillness, not loud, not bold, but trembling with truth. The lyrics told a story of love found, then lost, of promises whispered under stars that faded with the sunrise. It was the kind of song that didn't blame or beg. It just remembered softly, honestly, painfully. The first verse had people tilting their heads. The second had them frozen in place. By the time she reached the bridge, people were visibly crying. Not just the mothers and aunts, but grown men with reddened eyes. The waitstaff stopped moving. Even the musicians in the background looked down, humbled by the gravity of the moment. And Mason couldn't look away. He stood at the edge of the dance floor, Leila beside him, his arm around her waist slowly falling. His face was unreadable, part awe, part grief, part guilt. The song was their story, and not just his and Alara's, but a reflection of what he lost before he even realized it. Lila, to her credit, didn't flinch. She watched Alara with something like admiration, maybe even pain for her. She understood what this moment meant. She knew Mason had loved someone deeply once, and that a piece of that love was being released right here, in front of everyone. As Alara reached the final note, she let it linger. Not for drama, but because it needed to be felt. Then, silence. For a few moments, no one clapped. It was as if the room forgot what to do. Then, like thunder from far away, a slow ripple of applause began. Not polite, not rehearsed, but real. Heartfelt, staggered by emotion. Alara gave a small nod and walked off the stage. Alara didn't wait for anyone backstage. As soon as the curtains fell behind her, she kept walking past the catering tables, past the floral displays, past the astonished looks from staff who now saw her as something more than just an old name from a forgotten chapter. She walked out into the garden, where the night air wrapped around her like a blanket, both cold and freeing. Her heart was pounding, not from fear or regret, but from the sheer emotional weight of what she had just done. For years, her voice had been something private, something guarded. That night, it had become a weapon, a bomb, and a confession all at once. She leaned against a stone pillar, closing her eyes, not even aware that tears were streaming down her cheeks, until a soft voice broke the silence behind her. "You wrote that for him, didn't you?" Alara turned. It was Lila. Surprised, Alara opened her mouth, unsure of what to say. But Lila didn't wait for an answer. She stepped closer, her hands clasped gently in front of her, her bridal gown trailing behind like a whisper. There was no malice in her face, no resentment, just a quiet, thoughtful kind of respect. "He told me about you," she said. "Not in detail, just enough. He said he didn't know why things fell apart, only that he regretted not fighting harder." Alara nodded slowly, unsure if the ache in her chest was relief or a fresh wound. Sometimes it's not about who fought harder. Sometimes things fall apart because they're supposed to. Her voice was hoarse now, raw from both singing and feeling. Lila nodded in return. "That may be true, but that song? That was truth, and I think everyone in that room felt it." There was a long silence between them, the kind that didn't feel awkward, but necessary. Then Lila smiled, a soft, sad kind of smile, and said, "Thank you for singing it, for letting it go." And just like that, she turned and walked back inside, leaving Alara alone with the wind and the moonlight, and a heart that finally felt a little lighter. Inside the reception hall, the atmosphere had shifted. The conversations were softer now, more introspective. The guests, many of whom had never known heartbreak or had forgotten what it felt like, sat quietly, still replaying Alara's voice in their heads. It wasn't just a song. It was a reminder that love leaves echoes even when it's gone. Mason, meanwhile, stood near the bar, untouched glass in his hand, staring into a space far beyond the walls. The moment had broken something in him. Or perhaps it had finally allowed something inside him to break. Later that night, once the music resumed and the party tried to find its rhythm again, Mason would find Alara one last time. Not to beg, not to apologize, just to stand beside her, eyes full of everything he couldn't say. "I never deserved you," he whispered. Ale looked at him, not with anger or bitterness, but with the quiet strength of someone who had already healed. "You did, once, but life moved on." And in that moment, there was peace. Not between lovers, not even between friends, just two souls who had shared something beautiful and painful, and who could now walk separate paths without dragging the past behind them. By the end of the night, Alara slipped away unnoticed. No grand goodbye, no final bow. She had given the room her truth, and that was enough. She returned to her small apartment, kicked off her shoes, and sat in the dark, allowing the quiet to settle around her like an old friend. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid. To find out, over the next few days, her performance went viral. A guest had secretly recorded it on their phone, and within hours, clips were all over social media. Ex-girlfriend sings at wedding, leaves everyone crying, the captions read. Thousands of comments poured in. People from around the world connected with her story, even without knowing all the details. Some saw their own heartbreak in her words. Others found the courage to say goodbye to someone they had been holding onto for too long. Alara watched the attention grow with a strange detachment. She hadn't sung to be seen, she had sung to be free. But if her voice helped others feel something they hadn't felt in a while, then maybe that was its purpose all along. The days turned into weeks. She received invitations to perform at events, messages from producers, collaborations with other artists. Her inbox overflowed. But what meant the most were the quiet messages, those from people saying, "You helped me let go," or "That song felt like it was written for me." That's what music had always meant to her. Not the fame, not the spotlight. Just the ability to make someone feel less alone. As for Mason and Lila, they continued on their journey. Alara never kept in touch, and they never reached out again. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered if they ever talked about her. If they ever played the song again. If they ever truly understood what it cost her to sing it. But even if they didn't, it didn't matter. That night in Paris, with a single song, Alara had taken her pain and turned it into something sacred. She had spoken for every heart that was never heard. She had sung the truth no one dared to say. And in doing so, she found her own voice, finally, fully, and without apology. Alara never set out to become a symbol. She didn't ask for the attention, the headlines, or the emotional essays written by strangers dissecting her story. But once the video took off, it was as if the world had decided to carry her voice further than she ever intended it to go. She was suddenly invited to talk shows, podcasts, and storytelling platforms that asked her to share the story behind the song. Some hosts looked for drama, others wanted inspiration. But none of them knew the real weight behind the lyrics, the years of quiet pain, the long nights of wondering if her voice even mattered, the heartbreak that never had closure until that one trembling note under wedding lights. She turned down most interviews, not out of arrogance, but self-protection. The story wasn't just hers, it belonged to a version of her who no longer existed. A version that had loved Mason deeply, who once thought love could fix everything. That Alara had cried into pillowcases, rewritten the same melody 100 times, and disappeared into herself when silence was easier than speaking. The Alara of today? She had found her strength not in fame, but in the moment she faced a past love with grace instead of resentment. Still, the world had fallen in love with her narrative. Artists reached out to collaborate. A well-known pianist begged to produce a studio version of her song. Brands offered sponsorship deals, and one music label even offered her a contract. For a few weeks, her name trended beside chart-topping pop stars, but Alara kept her pace slow. She wasn't chasing a dream of stardom, she was listening for what felt right. One morning, as she sat by her window with tea in hand, she read a message from a girl in Brazil. It was written in broken English, but the meaning was clear. "You made me feel seen. I sing too. I was afraid. Now I want to be brave." Alara read it again, pressing a hand to her chest. That was it. That was the why. Not the views, not the applause, but that single flicker of courage passed from one stranger to another, like light through a cracked door. It was then Alara decided to record the song, not for fame, but for healing. She booked a small studio in the city, one that smelled of wood and quiet dreams. She brought her handwritten lyrics, slightly smudged at the edges from months of being folded and unfolded. As she stood behind the mic, her eyes closed, She didn't imagine the wedding crowd this time. She imagined every woman who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been asked to smile through heartbreak, every soul who had been told they weren't enough. Her voice came out softer this time. Fuller. There were no trembling hands, only steady breath. Each note felt like a journal entry, finally spoken aloud. When the last note faded, the sound engineer didn't say a word. He just took off his headphones slowly, looked at her with tears in his eyes and nodded. When the official recording was released, it didn't explode, it blossomed. Gently, widely, like ripples in still water. People sent it to loved ones, posted videos of themselves listening to it in the car. At night, after breakups, after revelations, some couples danced to it, others cried alone to it. It wasn't just a song anymore. It had become a shared experience, a release. And in the midst of it all, Alara kept writing. New melodies came to her, some joyful, some raw, some still healing. She no longer wrote just for herself, but for everyone who had written to her. For every comment that said, "Thank you." For every message that ended with, "I needed this." She never spoke of Mason again, not publicly, not even privately. His name faded from the interviews, the tags, the curiosity. And Alara never tried to resurrect it. Whatever had existed between them had been fully laid to rest with that performance. She harbored no hate. She carried no regret. Only the strange, bittersweet memory of love once held and gracefully let go. 1 year later, Alara found herself back in Paris, not by coincidence, but by choice. She had been invited to perform at an international storytelling music festival. The venue was nothing like the wedding hall. It was intimate, warmly lit, filled with people who came to listen, rather than judge. And this time, she wasn't backstage trembling. She stood tall, guitar in hand, voice steady. When the host introduced her, the crowd cheered softly. Many already knew her story. Others had simply come to hear what the world had been whispering about. She took a breath, smiled gently, and began. A new song. It wasn't the wedding song. It was something else, something born from the months of growth that followed. A song about beginnings, not endings. About forgiveness, not longing. It was gentler, brighter, and yet still threaded with depth. As the final note rang out, the audience rose in a standing ovation, not out of pity or surprise, but pure, heartfelt connection. And that was when Alara knew. She wasn't just the girl who sang at her ex's wedding. She wasn't just a heartbreak story gone viral. She was a voice, one that had found its strength in silence, its clarity in pain, and its purpose in the hearts of others. When the lights dimmed after her performance in Paris that night, Alara stayed behind, sitting quietly at the edge of the stage. She wasn't ready to leave yet. Something about the space, the warmth, the applause, the subtle hum of instruments being packed away reminded her how far she had come. A year ago, she had walked into a wedding hall as a woman still carrying invisible wounds. Now she stood as someone who had transformed her pain into something powerful, something she could offer the world. After the show, a small line of audience members waited to greet her. Unlike the autograph lines she had always imagined as a young girl, this one wasn't filled with screaming fans or flashing cameras. It was calm, genuine people looking her in the eye, thanking her not just for the music, but for the emotion behind it. One woman, probably in her 50s, squeezed Alara's hands and whispered, "I left my husband because of your song. I finally realized I deserved to be heard." Another, a teenager with trembling fingers, said, "You're the reason I dared to audition for the school choir." Every story they shared added another thread to the tapestry. Alara was weaving one she never planned, but had grown naturally from the seed of a single performance. The song at the wedding hadn't just been about letting go of Mason. It had been about reclaiming her own voice after years of being quiet for the sake of someone else's comfort. And now, that voice was giving others permission to do the same, back. In her hotel room that night, Alara sat by the window, watching the soft glow of Paris lights reflect across the Seine. She thought about the way life had turned, unexpectedly, and yet perfectly. She didn't have millions of followers. She wasn't selling out arenas. But she was seen, heard, and more importantly understood. Her songs weren't hits in the traditional sense. They were emotional landmarks in people's personal journeys. That meant more to her than any fame ever could. In the weeks that followed the festival, Alara began working on a full album. She titled it, Letters I Never Sent. Each track would be a story, some inspired by her own experiences, others inspired by the messages fans had sent her. There was one about a girl whose mother never said, "I'm proud of you," and another about a boy who watched his best friend fall in love with someone else. There was even one about forgiveness, how it often comes not with grand gestures, but with quiet acceptance. She rented a tiny cabin outside the city, surrounded by trees and silence. It was the kind of place where inspiration breathed easily. Mornings were filled with sunlight and the sounds of birds. Nights were candlelit and still. With her guitar by her side and a notebook filled with scribbled phrases, Alara wrote without pressure. The words flowed easily now, not because she had healed completely, but because she had stopped running from her feelings. Music was no longer a hiding place. It was a mirror. The album took 3 months to finish. When she finally uploaded it online, she did so quietly, without announcement or fanfare. Just a single post that read, "This is for anyone who's ever carried words in silence." Within hours, it began to spread, not with explosive speed, but with steady, meaningful traction. People shared it with captions like, "This broke me in the best way," or "Every song felt like it was written from my diary." One track in particular, "That Day in the Garden," became a soft favorite. It was a subtle reference to the night she sang at Mason's wedding, but only those who had followed her story closely recognized it. The lyrics were gentle, reflective, even grateful. There was no bitterness, only a memory of 2 lives crossing paths at a strange and painful intersection, and then moving forward in separate directions with dignity. Alara never mentioned Mason's name. Not in interviews, not in lyrics, not in conversation. That chapter had closed not with drama, but with a song, and that to her was enough. She didn't need revenge or recognition. She had something far greater, peace. Eventually, Alara began receiving invitations to speak, not just as a performer, but as someone who had something to say about healing, heartbreak, and creative expression. She was asked to talk to students, to women's groups, to mental health communities. In every room, she carried the same message, that being broken doesn't make you weak, and that the most powerful songs often come from the quietest pain. At one event, a young man raised his hand and asked, "Do you ever regret going to that wedding?" Alara paused before answering, not because she was unsure, but because the truth was heavy with emotion. She looked at the boy, smiled softly, and said, "No, I don't regret going. Because sometimes showing up for yourself means walking straight into the place that once broke you and choosing to sing instead of cry." The room went silent, and in that stillness, everyone understood. Months passed, and the world kept moving. Trends came and went, new viral sensations stole the spotlight, and Alara's name, once ever present in digital spaces, faded into a quieter orbit. But for her, that was never the goal. She didn't crave noise. She valued depth, impact that echoed long after the applause stopped. And so, she continued living a life of calm purpose, making music not for attention, but as an offering. She started mentoring young artists, many of whom had been inspired by her journey. She held small workshops, not in fancy studios or corporate-backed venues, but in community centers and converted coffee shops. Her goal was simple: to create safe spaces where voices that had been silenced could speak and be heard. She taught them how to write not just what sounded good, but what felt real. Write from the wound, not the ego, she would say, again and again, and the young ones listened. Because when Alara spoke, it wasn't with performance, it was with truth. One afternoon, after one of those workshops, she found herself walking through a local park. Children were laughing in the distance. Wind rustled gently through the trees. And beneath an old willow tree, she saw a young girl with headphones in, sitting with a sketchpad and mouthing the words to one of her songs. Alara didn't interrupt. She simply smiled, heart full, and kept walking. That moment, simple, unseen, unshared, was more meaningful to her than any viral chart dot at night. In her small apartment filled with plants, candles, and shelves of journals, Alara often reflected on how one moment of forced performance at a wedding had become the catalyst for everything that followed. She sometimes marveled at how life moves in strange circles, how the things that feel like endings are often only disguised beginnings. She never returned to Mason's world, never checked his social media, never stalked Leela's updates. She didn't need to. That version of her, the woman who sang from a place of raw heartbreak, had sung herself into freedom. And she honored that version not by clinging to the past, but by continuing to move forward, note by note. Eventually, a documentary filmmaker reached out to her, proposing a short film not about fame, but about the quiet power of emotional truth in music. Alara agreed under one condition: that it wasn't about the wedding. That moment was the spark, she told them, but it's not the whole fire. The film, titled Echoes in the Silence, followed her life as an artist, mentor, and human being choosing to live with vulnerability in a world that rewards performance. It received modest acclaim, but once again, what mattered more were the messages that came after. I showed this to my mother and she finally opened up. I sent this to my best friend. We cried together. Your story reminded me that my voice matters. As time moved on, Alara aged gracefully, with laugh lines from honest joy and a voice that grew richer, deeper. Her music evolved. So did her message. But one thing remained unchanged: the belief that even the softest voice can carry truth strong enough to shake a room. Years later, long after the world stopped talking about the girl who sang at her ex's wedding, a young journalist interviewed her for an article about lost voices in the music industry. Near the end, the journalist leaned forward and asked, "If you could go back to that night, would you still say yes to singing?" Alara didn't hesitate. Her smile was quiet but certain. "Absolutely," she said. "Because I didn't sing for them. I sang for me, and that song set me free." The article went largely unnoticed, but a clip of that quote circulated quietly online, reposted by fans who still remembered. And in small corners of the internet, her voice lived on, whispered between friends, played during midnight drives, and cherished by those who had once felt like their pain was too quiet to matter. In the end, Alara's legacy wasn't built on one song, one stage, or one heartbreak. It was built on a choice to use her voice, even when it trembled, to sing, even when it hurt, and to turn pain into melody, silence into strength.